Well, joining me in the studio is economist Dawie Roodt to talk about the impact of the 30% tariff from the US on South Africa that has been signed by President Donald Trump and how it is affecting South Africa's financial markets. Hi, Dawie. Thanks for speaking to us on a Friday afternoon.
Hello, Lena.
So, what effects has the tariff announcement had so far on the rand and markets in South Africa?
Well, it's already impacting on the South African economy via the financial markets. Of course, the rand took quite a knock because we all thought it's going to kick in on the 1st of August, but apparently it's been postponed now. But the rand took quite a knock and it went to about, I saw it trading at 18.30 to the US dollar at one stage. And that's really from 17.5. So that's quite a significant weakening in the exchange rate of the currency. It's not only because of the tariffs, it's also because of the Federal Reserve in the United States deciding not to cut interest rates. And that, of course, is supportive of the US dollars. But it's a combination of the two. But I guess that the tariffs now is the main reason why the rand took a bit of a knock. And of course, in the equity markets as well, equity markets down. They a little bit back later afternoon, but the equity markets were down more than 1% on all share index and the JSE earlier today. So certainly that it's already impacting on the South African economy. Then whether, I don't know when or what the tariffs eventually going to be, but certainly those tariffs will have an impact on the South African economy.
Well, it looks going to be 30% unless a miracle happens in the next 7 days.
And looking at the South African government, I'm not holding my breath for that one. But trying to calculate what the impact is going to be on the South African economy, of course, certain industries will be more heavily affected than others. Agriculture, the motor car industry. And when you talk about agriculture, it's sometimes it's specific production units, it's specific farms that will be much more severely impacted than other farms, depending on where you export your stuff to. Wine farms, for example, that export to the United States will be affected directly. But overall, the impact on the economy is actually not going to be that bad. My calculations suggest economic growth of 0.1, 0.2% lower than would have been the case. Otherwise, the Reserve Bank reckons about 100,000 jobs can be lost if it is at 30%, for example. Now, 0.2 or 100,000 jobs or so, it's not really the end of the world. But the reality is that the South African economy is hardly growing. So if we were growing at a rate of 4 or 5% and you take off 0.2%, then it's really not a big deal. But 0.2% of, say, 0.8%, it is a big deal. So we're talking about economic growth that's going to gradually slow down into, it seems to be 0.5 or 0.5% growth this year, somewhere between 0.5% and a full percentage point now. But every time when I get new economic statistics, I adjust my estimates for economic growth downwards. And that, of course, will have huge implications, not only for that 100,000 people that's going to lose their jobs, but also the other numbers, also the other ratios will move in a wrong direction. Like, for example, the fiscal deficit and the fiscal debt levels and those sort of things. And those things are really getting into danger territory now. We're talking about the debt levels, for example, and so on. So, yeah, so 0.2% is not much. The tariffs is not doesn't mean the end of the world, but everything adds up. And this is just another a nail in the coffin of the South African economy.
So, Dawie, what about inflation? How does this affect inflation targets?
Well, in fact, I think if you look at the tariffs only, it's possible that in the short term it can be good for inflation because those exporters are going to try to sell it locally. And that means there's an increase in supply, which in the short term could actually be good for inflation. But the interesting thing about inflation is that we've actually changed our inflation targets when the Reserve Bank met earlier this week. They reduced interest rates so by 25 basis points, which was pretty much expected. And I think there's room for much, much more. Remember, we have inflation targets of 3 to 6% officially. And that was the target band of the Reserve Bank. I don't like a band, I prefer a point. But the Reserve Bank then gradually over time changed that to 4.5%. Remember, it's the prerogative of the Minister of Finance to change the inflation targets. So, but the Reserve Bank targeted the mid-range, and that is 4.5%, between 3 and 6%. With the meeting this week, the Reserve Bank made it very clear, and in fact, they've said this previously, that they actually prefer to reduce the inflation targets to 3%, and they were waiting for the Minister of Finance to reduce officially the inflation target. But the Minister of Finance, like most ministers, they just sit on their hands, do nothing. And in the meantime, the Reserve Bank decided that they're going to go in alone, and they basically announced that they have new inflation target, and that is 3%. So that's actually quite exciting, actually, because they went over the head of the Minister of Finance and they decided unilaterally, listen, we're going to go for 3% and that's it, because now is the opportunity and now is the opportunity, in fact. So from now on, we've got a new inflation target. It's not really official, but that's what the Reserve Bank is going to target. They're going to target 3%. And that means that the interest rates are going to remain a little bit higher than what would have been the case previously. But then thereafter, once we've got inflation anchored at 3%, and once we've got inflation expectations down to 3%, then we can talk about a number of interest rate reductions. So well done to the South African Reserve Bank, and perhaps being a little bit cheeky, going over the head of the Minister of Finance, but well done for that move as well. So thanks to the Reserve Bank and thanks to Lesetja Kganyago. Fortunately, we've got that specific institution that still works well in South Africa.
Well, yes, at least they didn't call him a stubborn moron. Trump called Jerome Powell.
That is actually very interesting because, I mean, the South African economy is not going anywhere. And under these kind of circumstances, you would expect the politicians putting more pressure on the South African Reserve Bank. We had a call not too long ago again of the nationalization of the South African Reserve Bank, but the politicians are actually quite quiet in South Africa when it comes to monetary policy. So fortunately for that. But certainly, I'm very glad that we do not have a president that calls our governor of the South African Reserve Bank a moron, because he's certainly not. He knows what he's doing when it comes to monetary policy.
Well, there's another issue, and I think we should discuss quickly. Economists have previously suggested that South Africa should follow the India example, stay more neutral in its dealings with the Western allies and BRICS, and try to follow a middle path. But India has just been slapped with, what is it, 25% tariff. So does that suggest neutrality isn't enough to shield countries from economic pressure from the Trump administration?
Well, that's actually an interesting point you're making, because previously my advice to government was to be as neutral as possible, and that still is my advice, and try to be friendly with everybody and try to trade with everybody. And I mentioned India as an example of a country that still trade quite a lot with the Russians, for example, and they trade with the Chinese and they trade with the Americans, and they're all friendly with all of those trading partners. So I say, my advice is be like India. Try to be really neutral and do business with everybody. But Donald Trump is not seeing it that way, it seems. And he's getting very unhappy with India doing business with the Russians. And for that reason, he slapped his higher tariff on the Indians as well. So I guess being neutral is not good enough. You have to be in the American camp if you really want to get a good deal from Donald Trump. Being neutral is not necessarily the answer, it seems.
Yeah. Thanks again, and Dawie Roodt for speaking to us.